In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to knit this baby blanket pattern that I am naming Ellis. Now, a lot of my blanket patterns have really nice short repeats as they're targeted to the beginners amongst you who are wanting to tackle your first big project. And whilst Ellis is still a really simple repeat, it's a 26 row repeat, so it is at the longer end of the pattern repeats that I do. Don't let that put you off knitting this if you're a beginner, because I walk you through every single row, and it is no more complex than knowing how to work a knit and a purl stitch. You just need to be aware that you're going to need to read your stitches and keep track of what row you're on. If you're wanting to knit a baby blanket the same size as mine, 60 centimetres wide by 80 centimetres long, you are going to want 400 grams of double knit yarn. For those of you outside the UK, the equivalent yarn would be light worsted weight yarn or 3-weight yarn, and in terms of meterage, you're looking between 1,000 and 1,200 metres. Depending on your tension, you might find that you use slightly less than that, but I always like to overestimate when I'm telling you yarn amounts so that you can get enough yarn to finish the project, even if your tension is slightly different than mine. You are also going to need some 4mm size 6 knitting needles. You're going to want them to be circular needles that are at least 100 centimetres long, because straight needles or circular needles that are shorter than 100 centimetres just won't be long enough to accommodate your stitches comfortably. In addition to that, you are going to want some embroidery scissors and tapestry needles for when you sew in your yarn tails. And last but certainly not least, 2 stitch markers, and we use those to mark where our side borders end and our middle textured panel starts. It just makes working your rows so much easier, because you can just knit until you hit the stitch markers and know then that you can comfortably go into that middle textured panel. For my blankets, I like to give you the pattern multiple for that middle textured panel separately to the stitches that you cast on for your borders. That just gives you the freedom to change the border if you want, but still know what that main pattern multiple for the middle textured panel is. In the case of Ellis, the pattern multiple is 6 plus 3. So that means initially you want to cast on a number that is a multiple of 6, for instance 60, and then you're going to add on 3 additional stitches. Once you've done that, you can add your side border stitches on, and if you're using the same border as me, you're going to want to add an additional 18 stitches. That's 9 stitches for either side. If you're wanting to replicate my sample blanket, then you are going to want to cast on a total of 135 stitches, and that number includes the stitches for your side borders. For this tutorial, I'm just going to cast on a small sample, and as always, I choose to use the long tail cast on. However, if you prefer another type of cast on method, then please feel free to use that. The blanket will still work, your bottom edge just might look a little bit different to mine. This blanket is knitted all in one piece from bottom to top. So the first section that we need to tackle is that bottom garter stitch border. That consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way. So I'm going to walk you through row 1, and then I'm going to leave you to carry on and work rows 2 to 15 by yourself. Now, as the bottom border is garter stitch, it is really nice and simple to work. Every stitch in the row is the same, with the exception of this final stitch here. That's our selvage stitch, and we work that slightly differently just to give us a really nice neat long edge up the side edges of our border. So to start with, you are going to knit your way across the row, and you want to knit every single stitch until you have just 1 stitch left on your left hand needle to work. To work this final stitch here, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. It's a lot simpler than it sounds. So first things first, you want to get your working yarn to the front of your work. I'm a continental knitter, so I just hold it here and then I lift it out the way once I've finished the row. If you prefer to lift your working yarn all the way to the front of your work now, that's absolutely fine too. Once you've got that working yarn to the front of your work, you're going to grab this right hand needle and pop it into the final stitch from right through to left, so as if you were going to purl. Once that right hand needle is in, you are going to slide it firmly further onto the right hand needle with that left hand needle, and then once you're sure it's safely on that right hand needle, you can take your left needle out, and then all that's left to do is to make sure that this working yarn is at the front of your work. So that's row 1 of 15 done. I'm now going to go away and work rows 2 to 15 by myself, and I will leave you to do the same, and then I will rejoin you at the end of row 15 to show you how we tackle that middle textured panel that forms the bulk of our blanket. Now that our bottom garter stitch border is complete, it's time to move on to the main textured panel that forms the bulk of our blanket. We're going to start off with row 1, and I'm going to walk you through each of the 26 rows. The first time you work a row 1, we're going to do a little bit of setup work just to get our stitch markers in place, but every subsequent time that you return to work a row 1, you're just going to slip your markers instead of placing them. Start row 1 by knitting 9 stitches. Then you're going to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle. Next, you're going to carry on and knit across your row until 9 stitches before the end of the row, and that will be when you have 9 stitches left to work on your left hand needle. Once you get to that point, you are going to get the second of your 2 stitch markers and also pop it onto your right hand needle. Then you want to carry on and knit the next 8 stitches, and that should leave you with 1 final stitch left in the row to work. Just like with our bottom garter stitch border, for the end stitch we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front to carry on with that nice, lovely, neat looking side edge. Start row 2 by knitting the first 9 stitches. This is a good point to check that you have your stitch marker in the right place, because you should hit that first stitch marker after you have knitted your 9th stitch. Slip that stitch marker over from one needle to the next, and then you are going to purl all the stitches between the 2 stitch markers. So you are going to purl your way across your row until you get to that second stitch marker. Slip that second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Rows 3, 4 and 5, so the next 3 rows are all worked in exactly the same way. So I will show you how to work row 3, and then I'll leave you to carry on with rows 4 and 5 yourself. So for row 3, you are going to just quite simply knit your way across the row. Every single stitch, with the exception of the final stitch, is a knit stitch. You're going to slip your markers over from one needle to the next as you come to them, and then when you do get to that very last stitch in the row, you are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front, and you are going to repeat that process for 3 rows. So for rows 3, 4 and also row 5, and I will rejoin you at the end of row 5 and show you how to carry on with the rest of the repeat. Row 6, you are going to start by knitting those first 9 stitches. That should take you to your marker, and you are going to slip that marker over from the left needle to the right needle. Then, just like with row 2, you are going to purl all those stitches between the 2 markers. So purl your way across your row until you hit that second marker. When you reach that point, you are going to slip that marker over from one needle to the next and then knit the next 8 stitches. Last but not least, you are going to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Once again, the next 3 rows, so rows 7, 8 and 9, are all worked in exactly the same way, the same process that we did for rows 3, 4 and 5. So for rows 7, 8 and 9, you are going to knit your way across your row, knitting every single stitch. You're going to slip those stitch markers over from one needle to the next when you get to them, and just make sure that they don't fall off your needle. And then when you get to that very last stitch, you are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And that is for rows 7, 8 and 9. I'm going to go ahead and work those rows myself now, and I'll rejoin you at the beginning of row 10. Row 10 is the same as row 2 and row 6, but I will just go over it again for you. You are going to start by knitting those 9 stitches that take you to your first stitch marker. Slip the marker over from one needle to the next, and then you are going to purl your way across to your second marker. So all the stitches in between those two markers are purl stitches for this row. When you get to it, you're going to slip that second marker over and then carry on and knit 8 more stitches. Last but not least, you're going to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Rows 11, 12 and 13 are once again 3 identical rows. For those 3 rows, you are going to knit every single stitch with the exception of the final stitch. You're going to slip your stitch markers over as you get to them, and then when you do get to that final stitch of the row, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And you are going to repeat that for rows 11, 12 and 13, and then I will rejoin you at the beginning of row 14. Row 14 starts by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip the marker over, and then you are going to knit the next 3 stitches. Now we're going to jump into a 6 stitch repeat that we're going to work all the way across our row until we hit that second stitch marker, and that 6 stitch repeat goes as follows. You are going to purl 3 stitches and then knit 3 stitches. And you're going to repeat that purl 3, knit 3 combination until you hit your second marker, and if you've counted your stitches correctly, that should be after a knit 3. When you reach your second marker, you're going to slip it over from one needle to the next, and then you are going to knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave you with just your final stitch, and you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 15 is really nice and simple. You are going to knit your way across the row, knitting every single stitch, slipping your stitch markers over from one needle to the next as you come to them, and then for that very last stitch in the row, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Start row 16 by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip the marker over and then knit 3 more stitches. Then, just like row 14, you're going to jump into that same 6 stitch repeat that you're going to work across your row until you hit your second marker. And just as a reminder, that repeat goes as follows. You are going to purl 3 stitches and then knit 3 stitches. And you're going to again repeat that purl 3, knit 3 combination, and if you count your stitches correctly, you should again hit your second marker after a knit 3. Slip that second marker over from one needle to the next, and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish the row by slipping that last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 17 is a repeat of row 15, so you are going to just knit your way across the row, slip those stitch markers as you get to them, and then for that very last stitch of the row, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front instead of knitting it. Row 18 starts by knitting the 9 stitches that come before your first stitch marker. Slip that stitch marker over, and then you're going to purl the next 3 stitches. Now once again you're going to jump into a 6 stitch repeat that you're going to repeat across until your second stitch marker. It's slightly different to the previous 2 times, but it's very similar. Your 6 stitch repeat for this row is knit 3 and then purl 3. And you're going to repeat that knit 3 purl 3 combination all the way across until your second marker, and you should hit that second marker after you have worked a purl 3. Row 19 is another nice and easy one. Just knit your way all the way across your row. Every stitch in this row is identical with the exception of that final selvage stitch in the row. And don't forget, when you get to that last stitch, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 20 is a repeat of row 18, so you are going to start by knitting those 9 stitches that form our side garter stitch border. Slip your first marker over and then purl the next 3 stitches. Then you're going to jump into a 6 stitch repeat that you're going to repeat all the way across until you hit your second marker, and that is as follows. You are going to knit 3 and then purl 3. And you're going to repeat that knit 3 purl 3 combination all the way across until you hit your second marker, and that should be after you have worked a purl 3. Slip that second marker over when you reach it and then knit the next 8 stitches. That should just leave your last stitch, and you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 21 is another straightforward knit row. Knit your way all the way across, slip those markers as you come to them, and then don't forget that for that final stitch, instead of knitting it, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Start row 22 by knitting 9 stitches. That should take you to your first stitch marker, and when you get to it, you're going to slip it across from one needle to the next. Then you're going to carry on and knit 3 more stitches. And now once again you're going to jump into a 6 stitch repeat that you're going to work across until you hit your second marker, and for this row that repeat goes as follows. You are going to purl 3 and then knit 3. And you're going to work that purl 3, knit 3 all the way across until you hit your second marker, which should be after you have worked a knit 3. Slip that second marker over from one needle to the next and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 23 is another nice and simple one. You are going to knit your way across your row, slip those stitch markers over from one needle to the next as you come to them, and then finish off your row by slipping the final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 24 starts by knitting the first 9 stitches. Slip the stitch marker over and then knit 3 more stitches. Now you're going to jump into your 6 stitch repeat that you're going to work across your row until you hit that second marker, and for this row this repeat is purl 3 and then knit 3. And you're going to work purl 3, knit 3 all the way across until you hit that second marker. Slip that second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. Last but not least, slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Rows 25 and 26 are worked in exactly the same way. You are going to knit your way across the row, knit all your stitches, slip your stitch markers over as you come to them, and then for that very last stitch of the row, you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front, and you're going to repeat that for row 25 and then again for row 26. I will rejoin you at the end of row 26 at the end of our repeat to talk you through how we grow the rest of the blanket. These 26 rows that we've just worked form the building blocks of our blanket. What you are now going to go away and do is go back to row 1 and repeat the process again as many times as you need until your blanket is about 8 centimetres shorter than you want the overall length of your blanket to be. In the case of my blanket, I worked 9 repeats in total, so I went away and worked another 8 of these. Then once you're done with those repeats, before you start your top garter stitch border, you need to work rows 1 to 11 from the pattern once more, just to give you symmetry at the top and bottom of your blanket. What I will now do is go away and do that, so I'll work rows 1 to 11, then I'll come back and show you how we work that top garter stitch border. Your blanket will obviously be much bigger than my little sample here, but you can see by working rows 1 to 11 once more, it means that your top and bottom of your blanket will match perfectly. The next section that we need to work is that top garter stitch border. Just like our bottom garter stitch border, it consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way. So I'm going to walk you through how to knit row 1, and then I'm going to leave you to carry on and work rows 2 to 15 by yourself. The top garter stitch border is worked in exactly the same way as the bottom one, so every stitch in each row, with the exception of that final stitch, is a knit stitch. The final stitch in the row you are going to carry on slipping purlwise with the yarn in front, like you have done for every other row in this blanket. The one thing that you can do here the first time you work the first row is you can take away your stitch markers, because you don't need those anymore, because we no longer need to mark those side borders. So you are going to knit your way across the row, take away the stitch markers on row 1 because we don't need them anymore, and then when you get to the very last stitch of the row, you are going to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So that's row 1 of 15 done. Rows 2 to 15 are worked in exactly the same way, and I'm going to leave you to go away and work those by yourself, and I will rejoin you at the end of row 15 to show you how we work that cast off and get this project from on our needles as a work in progress to something that is finished and neat and tidy and ready to gift. The very last row of any knitting project is of course your cast off row, and for my blankets I like to use a really nice simple knitted cast off. I like the look it gives, and most importantly it's nice and easy to work. In this video I'm just going to show you how to work the first few stitches and then leave you to carry on with the rest of your row yourself. If you need a more in-depth video, then I have one that is more designed for beginners, and I'll link that above here now. To start your knitted cast off you want to knit 2 stitches. Try not to knit these too tight, because if you work your cast off row too tightly, when it comes to taking your blanket off your needles, your blanket will pull in because the stitches on your cast off row are tight and it won't lay nice and flat. So keep that tension nice and relaxed for this row. Once you've knitted those first 2 stitches, you are going to grab your left hand needle and pop it into the first of the 2 stitches from left through to right. Pop your index finger on that second stitch just to make sure that you don't accidentally take it off your needles when you're doing this lift and pull section, and you're going to use your left hand needle to lift this first stitch up and over the second stitch you worked and completely off your needles, and you will go from 2 stitches on this right hand needle down to 1. Then you are going to knit 1 stitch to bring you back up to 2 stitches on this right hand needle, and then you're going to repeat that process again. So left hand needle into the first of the 2 stitches from left through to right. Use that left hand needle to lift that stitch up and over the other stitch on your needle, and then completely off your needle, so you go back down to 1 stitch on that right hand needle. And you're going to repeat that process of knitting 1 stitch and lifting 1 stitch all the way along your row, and I will rejoin you when you have no stitches left to work on this left hand needle and just 1 stitch left on this right hand needle. Once you reach the final stitch in your cast off row, you can break your yarn. You want to leave yourself a nice long tail so that you have plenty to sew in with once you have finished your work, and then just to secure this final stitch I'd like to do this. So I will pull up on this final stitch and make it bigger, and at this point we can get rid of our knitting needle. Then you are going to get this big loop and pop your finger and thumb through it, and with your finger and thumb grab that yarn tail and pull it all the way through the loop so it's coming through the middle of the loop. Then hold your corner firmly here so you don't stretch it out of shape, and you are going to pull on that tail to make that loop smaller. Give it a nice firm tug so it's as small as possible, and then once you sew your end in, you are going to have a nice neat corner to finish off your blanket. Just a couple of final bits and bobs before I leave you to your knitting. I often get asked if you can knit my blanket patterns in any weight yarn. The answer is absolutely yes. What you just need to be aware of is if your yarn is thicker, you might want to cast on less stitches and work less repeats, and if you cast on the same amount of stitches and work the same amount of repeats, you are going to end up with a bigger blanket. And if you use a thinner yarn than I've used, you are going to want to cast on more stitches and work more repeats, because if you work the same amount of stitches and repeats that I have, your blanket will be smaller. And also just make sure if you are choosing a different weight of yarn, you're going to want to be led by the ball band with regards to what size knitting needle you need to use. For those of you that like to have written instructions to follow along to, I have a free version of the written pattern on my blog. And then for those of you that want something that is more concise and printer friendly, I sell a ad-free PDF for a small fee on both Ravelry and Etsy. All that's left for me to do now is leave you with another little bit of knitting inspiration, and I will be back for another video soon.